And this is just a section that I have for white helpers, right? And I just say this out loud: your whiteness presents an obvious barrier and potential trigger when you're working with Black clients who've been victims of sexual violence. Okay? Cultural competence is demanded. And not only must you understand Black racial trauma, you must also understand your own white racial trauma. And this is the slide that I call the most dangerous slide in my slide deck. I'm just going to put it up here for a moment and say that if we're going to think about Black trauma, we also need to appreciate that as white people working with Black people, we also need to be able to unpack and be conscious of the white racial trauma that we bring into that space, you know, and that my construct, it's and again, I'm doing it an injustice in this time that we have, but my construct of white racial trauma helps us to understand white supremacist acculturation as a traumatic formulation. Okay, I'm not going to try to explain that now, but suffice to say that I believe that these two things are the examples and the experiences of how Black and white people both suffer from and have their psychologies shaped by our shared tragic racial history. Now, certainly some people have been economically privileged and some people have been economically disadvantaged by that history, but we have all had our psychologies misshapen by it. I say that, we need to be able to unpack our racist acculturation. We need to acknowledge it. We need to build relationships with Black colleagues. We need to contribute substantially in exchange for our learning. We need to read. And as I said, read, and find our role in anti-racist activism.
Thank you on behalf of the Colchester Sexual Assault Centre and all of our attendees. We were honored to have you with us today and sharing your perspective with us. And I wish we did have more time to really or better understand your perspective there, and certainly love to have you back again someday. I think one of the things that organizations like ours and in the nonprofit sector and in here across Nova Scotia is that they are predominantly run or visibly operated by white people. So what can we do to better support the communities who are disproportionately impacted by sexual violence that we can do in our own offices every day?
Well, I think that the first thing we need to do is we need to really build relationships with those communities, right? We need to recognize, I think let's be plain. We're in a Black Lives Matter moment, in a Idle No More, Truth and Reconciliation, Land Back moment. Every single organization must find its powerful and appropriate relationship with Indigenous, Black, and other racialized people. That is an imperative, right? These days, if you're not doing that, if it is not central to your mission, then you're really out of date. So you have to look look around you and find out where are the Black organizations and how do we show up to be an ally to them. And that may stretch us a little bit, because when we show up to ask that question, the Black community may suggest a way of interacting with them and supporting them that you interpret as outside of your mandate. And if you are wanting to build those relationships so that you can fulfill your mandate, you must cross the bridge that the community identifies for you to cross, right? Otherwise, you are perpetuating a colonial disposition in your relationship with the racialized people that you're seeking to serve. Right? Right?
And I'm sure that the approaches to supporting people of African descent, I'm sure that varies differently from African Nova Scotian people, from immigrant Black people. I'm sure those experiences are very different, but are there any kind of commonalities or similarities to approaches to make sure that you're not missing one group or the other?
Well, I think that, again, if we think about intersectionality, we need to recognize all of the complexities of communities. So I'm talking particularly about the Black male experience, but I didn't talk about the Black queer male experience versus the Black straight male experience. I didn't talk about the Black trans male experience, and I certainly didn't talk about in particular the Black African immigrant experience versus the Black Caribbean immigrant experience. So I'd say that the thing that is similar is that all Black people have been victims of white supremacist colonization, enslavement, and the like, right? So that is a very common experience. So when you open up race as a topic of conversation and a focus of treatment, it's the therapist's job to open the door. It's the client's job to paint the picture, right? Because they will paint their unique picture of what it is to be racialized and to be Black, you know?
We do have a question here from one of the attendees, and they're wondering if you think that the sexual trauma that that Black people experience is indirectly resulted by that hypersexual or aggressive historical element that you spoke about earlier?
I would say this, that there's a problem here that sometimes Black identity has been corrupted by the history of oppression, and so this thing that I'm talking about the hyper masculine, hyper machismo, this kind of thing is a corrupted stereotype, right? It's almost like an internalized racism. In fact, it's a stereotype that has been foisted on Black people because the sexuality of Black men has been demonized since the arrival of since first contact between Europeans and Africans, right? The savage Black man who's here to rape your women. And I would say, though, that stereotype has been adopted as a type of identity that then gets reflected back by the Black community in hip hop gangster kind of music, and in some of the kind of, if you think about the blaxploitation films of the 70s, that this was an identity that was given to us, and then we adopted it in small part as a position of power. And the blaxploitation films are very, very controversial because on the one hand, they perpetuated this stereotype of Black people, but on the other hand, gave, made some Black folk who were actors a lot of money during that period of time. So they were celebrated because some of those heroes, didn't give white people the time of day. So we kind of like those heroes, even though they were living out a stereotype that was a negative stereotype. Yeah. So it is a little complex to unpack that. But I think that when we work with Black folk, particularly those who are victims of sexual violence, it might be hard for them to identify as a victim if they're carrying this identity around as if they're supposed to be the hypersexual aggressive individual, right? Right. So you have to work through the stereotype to get at the experience and help the person unpack their own thoughts and feelings about the sexual violence that they've experienced. Very, very difficult terrain.
Right. Yeah, we do have another question from a sane nurse. So she is a white female. Is there any advice that you can give her when responding to emergency cases in the hospital system?
That's a good question. One of the things I would say is that, and I say this to all the people who, it doesn't matter what scenarios, when you are working with a Black client, you must find a way to make the race question transparent, right? And I don't have a script for you for that. I think it's kind of like learning a second language. My former partner, Robin Metcalf, always used to say, anybody can learn to speak a second language. You just have to be willing to speak it poorly for 7 years, right? So what I encourage people to do is to do these things, build relationships, contribute, read, find your role in anti-racist activism. But in those first exchanges, you can actually say, hi, I'm Robert Wright, and I'm your sane nurse today. And I just want to let you know that, that I'm sensitive to the fact that I'm a white nurse and you're a Black client. And there's likely some elements of our work together today that are going to have a racial element to it. And I'm going to do my best to be sensitive to that, but I want to let you know that I'm ready to be corrected or ready to be directed as you see fit. Just opening the door, right? Because if you don't open the door, then even if the client is having ideas that being Black is a factor here, they may not have language for that. Remember, you're the sane nurse. They're just a person who's a victim of sexual violence. They don't necessarily have a deep racial analysis, but they're in their trauma. And this trauma of this contemporary sexual experience is resonating with other experiences. And by opening the door to the discourse of race and historical race trauma, you might give that person the ability to walk through that door and say, yes, I mean, it was like, and whatever their experience is. So it's about opening the door.
A similar question yesterday during the LGBTQIA+ session where just changing your delivery and the words that you use. And like yesterday, we talked about when you approach somebody for the first time, share your pronouns just so they will know that you are a welcoming or understanding person, which kind of opens doors. Or ask them, how would you like to self-identify? So it kind of opens the space. So it's, certainly two different, scenarios we're talking about, but just that approach is the same to create that opening, welcoming, inclusive, understanding environment so they can feel more free to share their experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the self-identification question is really important in the area of race too, right? When my grandmother and mother were alive, I used to joke and say we had a colored lady, a black lady, and an African Nova Scotian all alive at the same time in the same family, right? So we should say, the question could be in your intake, hi, one of the questions, how do you identify in terms of your race, ethnicity, and culture? Right? And for some clients that might catch them off guard. I don't know. But for other clients, it might be, oh, well, I'm African Nova Scotian. Okay, so now you've opened a door. You've begun the conversation. Okay. Is there anything particular about being an African Nova Scotian that I should be aware of as we begin this exam today? Right?
I love that. Yeah, that's great advice.
Very simple questions. It just opens the door. And even if the client hasn't got a clue what you're talking about, like, well, I don't know. I don't know. I've never had an exam like this before. I don't want. You've opened the door, and you can say, well, if at any time the issue of race comes up, and it likely will, because race is everywhere, just let me know. We can talk about that. No, I just think that this is an amazing series that you're doing. And again, in these brief sessions, you're not going to walk away with all of the competencies that you need to deal with every kind of person that crosses your door. But the door has been opened for you. Right? And now it's up to you to walk through it. Right?
Yeah,
So,
certainly in an hour or an hour and a half, we can only scratch the surface of having a full or comprehensive understanding of the 4 marginalized communities that we're showcasing or profiling over this week. But yeah, like you say, it starts the conversation, and at least we start asking ourselves the questions, and then hopefully take this opportunity to learn more and implement that in our workplaces or in our everyday lives, because trauma and sexual violence is not just a woman's issue or a particular culture or ethnicity issue. It is a societal one. It's systemic. It impacts us in every way, but it's those unique kind of intricacies that are important for us to examine, especially for the racialized and marginalized communities, because they are disproportionately higher.
Absolutely. And remember that the skills of cultural competence are transferable. So as you begin to get better at working with queer folk, you will be better at working with Indigenous folk and Black folk and immigrant folk and poor folk, and that whole, and all those diversities, rural folk, rich folk, urban folk, the better we get at acknowledging diversity, the more skill we have at managing diversity in all of its quirkiness, Yeah.
Well, one thing I learned many years ago in my career is that you will never know everything, but if you can attempt to better understand everything, then you're doing much better. And that was our intention with developing this speaker series, is just to start those conversations and to give the opportunity to showcase the communities that we're profiling. So
it's a fantastic thing you're doing. It's a fantastic thing. And I see folk there. Thank you so much for your messages. I appreciate that so much. The appreciations are I feel that. So thanks so much.
You are a very popular and well-respected guy, and we were honored to have you with us today. And I think, you know, that is the perfect way to end the session today. Was everyone showing their thanks and appreciation for your contribution to the series here today.